30-year-old Rashawn Wallace shot and killed 33-year-old Damon Reed after he allegedly attacked her. It happened on Brook Hollow Drive in Jackson. Wallace is charged with murder. It started with breaking news: a nurse in Jackson, Mississippi, charged with killing her husband after an argument over a Facebook friend request. Reporters gathered outside the Hinds County Courthouse, cameras flashing as 30-year-old Rashawn Wallace appeared in handcuffs, her face hidden behind a mask and tears. The story quickly spread. A wife. A mother. A nurse accused of murder. Her bond was set at $50,000. Headlines called it a fatal argument over a friend request. To most, it sounded absurd, something so small ending in bloodshed. But behind those headlines was a home full of tension, pride, and silence. Brook Hollow Drive, a quiet suburban street lined with single-story homes and aging oak trees, had never made the news before. Neighbors described the morning of February 23, 2025, as calm, birds chirping, sunlight slipping through thin curtains, kids preparing for church. Then came the screams. Within minutes, sirens echoed down the narrow road, and yellow police tape surrounded a house that once smelled of coffee and baby lotion. Inside, 33-year-old Damon Reed lay dying on the living room floor while his wife, still in her work scrubs, performed CPR, sobbing and begging him to stay alive. Police body cam footage later captured a scene that broke hearts across the city: a woman covered in blood, trembling, whispering again and again, "I didn't mean to." Officers tried to calm her down as paramedics worked around her, but she wouldn't stop. "Please, God, don't take him from me." By the time the ambulance arrived, Damon was gone. What led to that moment wasn't a stranger, a break-in, or a robbery. It was a message notification, one friend request that sparked suspicion, confrontation, and tragedy. Damon made coffee that morning. Rashawn checked her phone. Minutes later, a gun went off. By the time the sirens reached Brook Hollow Drive, a marriage, a family, and 2 futures were already gone, all over one Facebook friend request. In the days that followed, the story flooded social media timelines across the country. Commenters argued about guilt and innocence, about love and control, about how fast a moment can turn from calm to chaos. Hashtags appeared overnight: hashtag justice for Rashawn, hashtag justice for Damon, each carrying thousands of opinions, none capturing the full truth. To many, it was another story of domestic violence. To others, it was self-defense. But for those who knew them, it was something else entirely: 2 people bound by love, undone by mistrust, living in a world where one argument could be fatal. Rashawn Wallace wasn't just a name on a headline. She was a licensed practical nurse who worked at a local clinic. Friends called her soft-spoken, hard-working, and deeply private. Her colleagues described her as the kind of nurse who prayed with her patients. At 30, she was juggling motherhood, night shifts, and a husband who was struggling to rebuild himself after a rough few years. Damon Reed, born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, had a charm that filled any room. He was protective, proud, and carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that masked his own insecurities. When he met Rashawn, he was drawn to her calmness. She, in turn, admired his strength. Together, they looked like the perfect couple, until the quiet moments between them turned heavy. Their marriage wasn't new to arguments. Neighbors said they'd occasionally heard raised voices, but nothing alarming. They loved hard, and they fought hard. In public, they smiled for pictures. In private, they clashed over small things that slowly grew into bigger ones: money, time, jealousy, control. Rashawn worked long hours, often double shifts. Damon stayed home more, sometimes helping with their young child, other times scrolling through his phone, comparing their life to the highlight reels of others. Social media became a silent third presence in their marriage, a window that showed too much and healed too little. On the morning of the shooting, it was calm. Rashawn had finished a long shift the night before and was preparing to rest before taking her child to a family event. Damon brewed coffee, and the two exchanged few words. The tension was familiar, not explosive, but simmering, like a conversation half finished. When Rashawn's phone lit up with a notification, a simple Facebook friend request, Damon noticed. He asked who it was. She said, just someone from work. But that was enough. What began as a question turned into an accusation, and what followed next would change everything. Witnesses said they heard a loud argument around 9:30 a.m., shouting, followed by a sudden silence, and then a single gunshot. When officers arrived, Rashawn was on her knees beside Damon's body. The 911 call recorded her voice breaking as she cried, "He came at me, I didn't mean to." Over the following hours, detectives pieced together what had happened, or tried to. Rashawn told them she had fired a warning shot first. When Damon refused to back down, she fired again. She said it was self-defense, that he was angry, that she was afraid. But fear and intent are two things the law doesn't always measure the same way. That morning, her young child was inside the home, watching from another room. Too young to understand what was happening, yet old enough to remember the sound that split the morning. Police took the child to a relative's house as Rashawn sat in the back of a cruiser, staring blankly through the window. For hours, she didn't speak. Later, when officers asked if she wanted water, she said softly, "I just want to wake up." The city of Jackson had seen violence before, but something about this case struck differently. It wasn't a gang feud, a robbery, or a stranger's crime. It was a woman many people trusted, someone who cared for others daily, now accused of taking a life. At her bond hearing, Rashawn stood before the judge in a pale jumpsuit, her hands trembling as the prosecutor described the scene. When the judge announced her bond, $50,000, she nodded silently, as if it no longer mattered. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But she kept her head down, her eyes swollen from crying. Across social media, opinions split sharply. Some said she snapped. Others said she survived. On one post, a woman commented, "You never know what someone endures before they pull the trigger." Another replied, "He didn't deserve to die over a friend request." The debate grew louder than the truth itself. For every voice demanding justice for Damon, there was another pleading compassion for Rashawn. The lines between victim and perpetrator blurred, and what began as a local story became a national talking point about love, pride, and fear. The tragedy on Brook Hollow Drive forced a question that lingers long after the police left: what really happened between those walls that morning? Was it self-defense, or a moment of rage? Did fear pull the trigger, or frustration? The answers lie somewhere between two hearts that once loved each other and one second that ended everything. And so, as the news cameras moved on to the next story, the quiet house on Brook Hollow Drive sat empty, its front porch still stained with memories, its walls still echoing the sound of that morning. Inside, what was once a home became evidence. A couch. A coffee cup. A single phone notification. A gun. Join me as we begin to uncover what truly happened in the case of Rashawn Wallace and Damon Reed, a story that challenges everything we think we know about love, fear, and self-defense. To understand what happened on that quiet Sunday morning, we have to go back to the beginning, before the gun, before the argument, before the friend request. Rashawn Wallace wasn't always a headline. She was a young nurse with quiet dreams and heavy responsibilities. Born and raised in Mississippi, she was known for her discipline, her kindness, and the way she carried the weight of her family with quiet grace. She had always been the dependable one, the one who stayed late at work, the one people called when things went wrong, the one who fixed everyone's pain but ignored her own. Damon Reed came into her life at a time when she wasn't looking for love. He was from Atlanta, smooth-talking, confident, and a little broken in the ways that made women want to heal him. He'd been through setbacks, lost jobs, strained family ties, and a few mistakes that left him searching for purpose. When he met Rashawn through a friend at a small church gathering, he saw someone steady, someone who believed in him when few others did. Rashawn, on the other hand, saw in him the promise of warmth and excitement she'd long been missing. He made her laugh, made her feel seen. And for a woman who'd spent years putting others first, that meant something. Their romance moved fast. Within months, they were inseparable. Friends described their chemistry as intense, the kind that burned bright but left scars when things went wrong. Damon moved to Jackson to be closer to her, and soon they shared a home. When Rashawn got pregnant, she was scared but hopeful. She wanted to believe that love and family could fix what the world had broken. But reality came quickly. Between late-night shifts at the clinic and early morning feedings, Rashawn carried most of the weight, financially, emotionally, and mentally. Damon tried to find stable work but struggled to hold it down. He felt the imbalance but didn't know how to say it without sounding weak. It's in those quiet imbalances that love begins to change. Resentment crept in slowly, hidden beneath laughter, tucked between apologies. Rashawn started working longer hours, often coming home exhausted, while Damon began spending more time online, scrolling through social media feeds that showed other men doing better, other families looking happier. He started to compare, and comparison turned into criticism. He'd ask why she smiled in pictures at work, who texted her late at night, why she was always too tired. For Rashawn, these questions became exhausting, each one chipping away at the peace she tried to maintain. But relationships don't collapse in a single argument. They crack slowly, under pressure no one wants to admit. Rashawn would sometimes confide in coworkers, saying, "He loves me, but sometimes I feel like I can't breathe." They'd tell her to take a break, maybe spend a weekend away, but she'd shake her head, "It's not that easy." Damon wasn't violent, not in the beginning. But his words could cut. The arguments were sharp, full of pride, both of them trying to win instead of understand. He hated feeling powerless. She hated being accused. Neither could see that both were hurting in the same place, fear of being unloved. Neighbors remembered their home as peaceful but tense. Curtains often closed. Cars parked close. Music playing late into the night. They'd see Rashawn leaving early, scrub still wrinkled, coffee in hand, while Damon stood on the porch scrolling through his phone. It looked normal, but something was changing underneath. The distance grew until even their small moments, dinner, television, laughter, felt strained. The love was still there, but it was buried under suspicion and unspoken exhaustion. Then came the messages. Damon had started checking Rashawn's phone more often, sometimes while she was asleep. He'd scroll through her social media, reading harmless comments and interpreting them as betrayal. She'd wake up and find her apps logged out, her notifications cleared. When she confronted him, he'd say, "I just don't trust people." What he really meant was, "I don't trust myself." In many ways, Damon's pride became the quiet enemy of their marriage, a man desperate to feel secure, trapped in the feeling that he wasn't enough. But Rashawn wasn't innocent either. Over time, she stopped explaining. She grew colder, more private. The love that once made her soft now made her guarded. She began sleeping in the guest room on nights after big arguments. At work, her colleagues noticed she seemed distracted. She'd forget small things, mix up schedules, stare off between patients. One of her coworkers recalled, she looked tired in her soul. It wasn't just about work or motherhood. It was about the slow unraveling of a marriage she still hoped to save. Around early February, just weeks before the shooting, things became worse. Damon found a series of old messages on Rashawn's Facebook, nothing inappropriate, just casual chats from coworkers, but to him, it was proof she was disrespecting their home. They argued for hours. That night, a neighbor reported hearing something crash inside the house, a lamp or a chair. But by morning, they were back to their routine, pretending nothing had happened. Like many couples, they learned how to cover wounds with routine, smiles on the porch, Sunday photos at church, polite greetings to neighbors. On the surface, everything looked fine. Inside, they were both drowning. Still, despite the cracks, there were good days. There were mornings when Rashawn brought him breakfast in bed, and evenings when they danced quietly in the kitchen after putting their child to sleep. It's those moments that make these stories so tragic, the reminder that even in brokenness, love still tries to breathe. She believed that.
You ain't the one for me, baby. You ain't got shit I need. You want me to take my time with you. Maybe I'm at your speed. Maybe I'm at your lead. You ain't even got no cheese. Well, maybe I'm just too G's for you. Maybe I'm just too street. I can't even roll in peace. Everybody notice me. I can't even go to sleep. I'm rolling on the beam. They trying to get me, ain't got on my knees like Jesus, please. He don't believe in Jesus. Why you got a Jesus piece? If you wanna leave, just leave. But you ain't gotta lie to me. Even the blind can see that you ain't gon' ride for me. You ain't showing me the love you said you got for me. There ain't no loyalty, you lied to me. You said that you gon' ride for me. Tell me again, my baby.
Time and patience could heal them. He believed that love meant control. Neither realized that their definitions of love were pulling them in opposite directions. By mid-February, the argument that would change everything had already started forming in small pieces, small suspicions, quiet doubts, the feeling of being unseen. On the Friday before the shooting, Rashawn told a friend she was done arguing, that she just wanted peace. That same weekend, Damon told someone he couldn't keep living like this. They were both tired. Both wounded. Both standing on the edge of something neither could name. So when that Facebook friend request came through on the morning of February 23rd, it didn't just arrive on a phone. It landed on months of tension, insecurity, and silence. One small spark in a room already filled with emotional gasoline. Damon saw it not as a notification but as confirmation, proof of betrayal, real or imagined. And Rashawn, after months of being accused, finally snapped. But before the gunshot, before the scream, before the blood, there was just a man and a woman sitting in their living room, both broken in their own way, waiting for the other to say something that could still save them. That morning, Rashawn texted a coworker she'd be late. She brewed coffee, changed her child's clothes, and opened her phone to a simple notification, friend request from Jonathan Miles. A coworker from the clinic. Innocent. But Damon saw it first. Within seconds, everything that had been quietly building between them erupted. It began as something small. A question. A tone. A look. Rashawn was seated at the kitchen counter when Damon walked in holding her phone. His voice wasn't loud at first, just cold. "Who's Jonathan?" he asked. She looked up, confused. "He's a coworker." Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. Damon didn't hand it over. He stared at the screen, then at her. In that silence, the air between them changed. It wasn't about Jonathan. It wasn't even about Facebook. It was about everything that had been unsaid for months. Rashawn stood slowly, reaching for her phone again, but he pulled it back. "Why are you adding men on Facebook?" he asked. She sighed, already exhausted. "Damon, it's nothing. I work with him. He sent a request, I accepted. That's all." But he wasn't hearing her. His mind was already running through old memories, old fears, old nights when he thought she didn't love him the same. He'd been holding on to so much, the lost jobs, the late nights, the way she smiled at her phone sometimes. Every insecurity he'd buried began to rise all at once. The argument grew quickly. Rashawn's voice cracked as she tried to explain, but Damon's words overpowered hers. "You think I'm stupid," he shouted. "You think I don't see what's happening?" She shook her head, her eyes already wet. "No, Damon. You're seeing something that's not there." He moved closer, still clutching the phone, his voice trembling with anger and hurt. "You're lying." And in that moment, the kitchen, once filled with the smell of coffee and soft gospel music, turned into a battlefield of pride and pain. Neighbors would later tell police they heard shouting. It wasn't the first time, but this time it sounded different. Louder. Sharper. More desperate. Rashawn's child was in the next room, the television turned up high to drown out the noise. She begged Damon to calm down, but he was too far gone in his thoughts. The betrayal he imagined felt real enough to make his hands shake. He slammed the phone down on the table so hard the screen cracked. Rashawn flinched, and that movement, that small flinch, became the turning point. Damon stepped closer. She backed away. Her heart raced, not just from fear but disbelief at how quickly things had gone wrong. In her later statement, Rashawn said she saw something in his eyes that morning she'd never seen before, a kind of rage mixed with heartbreak. She said he advanced toward her, his voice growing louder, his chest heaving. She tried to walk away, but he followed, shouting things she would later wish she could unhear. When he grabbed her arm, she pushed him back, her voice trembling as she said, "Stop." That's when she ran to the bedroom, where she kept her small handgun in a dresser drawer, a weapon she'd bought years ago after a break-in in their old neighborhood. She said she never thought she'd have to use it. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Damon followed her down the hallway, still yelling. She turned, holding the gun in both hands, her voice breaking as she said, "Please, just stop." He didn't. She warned him again. "I said stop, Damon." Then a single deafening sound echoed through the house. The first shot, a warning, according to Rashawn. The bullet lodged into the wall behind him. For a moment, everything went still. Damon froze, his eyes wide, his breath short. The world seemed to pause, just long enough for both of them to realize what had just happened. Then he stepped forward again. The second shot came almost instantly after. This time, it hit him. Damon staggered backward, clutching his chest, eyes wide in shock. The look on his face wasn't anger anymore, it was disbelief. Rashawn dropped the gun and screamed his name, rushing toward him as he collapsed to the floor. "No, no, no," she cried, pressing her hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. She called 911 with trembling fingers, her voice shaking so violently that the dispatcher had to ask her to repeat her address 3 times. The 911 recording would later be played in court. In it, you can hear her crying, gasping between words. "Please hurry. He's bleeding. I didn't mean to, he came at me." You can hear her trying to perform CPR, counting breaths, her voice cracking with every press on his chest. The child's faint crying can be heard in the background. The dispatcher tries to keep her calm. "Ma'am, stay with me. Help is on the way." But Rashawn keeps saying the same phrase over and over, "I didn't mean to." When police arrived, they found her on her knees, covered in blood. Officers told her to move back, but she wouldn't. "He's not breathing," she screamed. It took 2 officers to gently pull her away. Body cam footage later revealed her trembling hands and tear-streaked face as she collapsed against the wall, whispering prayers under her breath. "Please let him live. Please." Paramedics worked quickly, but Damon was unresponsive. They pronounced him dead at the scene. Rashawn was escorted outside, still in shock, her scrubs soaked, her hair matted against her face. As the sun rose higher, Brook Hollow Drive filled with flashing lights and quiet whispers. Neighbors stood behind yellow tape, watching the young mother being led away in handcuffs. One neighbor later said, "She kept saying, 'I told him to stop.' Over and over. Like she couldn't believe what just happened." Another said, "We heard one shot, then another. Then silence. It was the worst kind of quiet I've ever heard." At the station, detectives questioned Rashawn for hours. She sat with her hands folded, staring at the table. Her statement never changed, she feared for her life. She said Damon had never hit her before, but that morning she felt cornered, trapped in a space where her words no longer worked. When asked why she didn't just run, she said quietly, "Because my child was in the house." Investigators later confirmed that the gun belonged to her and was legally registered. They also verified that the first shot was fired into the wall, evidence that aligned with her story. Still, police weren't sure. Intent is difficult to measure, and emotion can blur the line between fear and anger. By evening, she was charged with murder. The news broke quickly, nurse in Jackson charged with killing husband after argument over Facebook friend request. Headlines repeated the same words, stripping away everything human. To the public, it was a simple story, a jealous wife, a dead husband, a broken family. But to those who had known them, it was far more complicated. This wasn't a monster and a victim. This was a marriage, one built on love, frustration, pride, and silence, that finally exploded under the weight of its own secrets. As officers led Rashawn to a holding cell, she turned once more and asked, "Can I see him?" They told her no. That night, alone in a cold room, she cried until her voice went hoarse. She whispered prayers not for freedom, but forgiveness. And in another building across town, Damon's mother was being told her son was gone. The same sentence, two different rooms, both filled with disbelief. By the next morning, the story had already escaped the walls of the Jackson Police Department. What began as a domestic disturbance on Brook Hollow Drive was now breaking news across Mississippi. Headlines read, "Nurse shoots husband over Facebook friend request." The words were sharp, simplified, and designed to provoke. It didn't matter that the details were still unclear, the world had already chosen sides. Within hours, her photo, in an orange jumpsuit, began circulating online. Her face was swollen, her eyes red, her lips pressed tight as if she was still holding back the scream from the night before. At the Hinds County Courthouse, reporters waited in the early morning cold. The cameras were ready long before Rashawn arrived. When she stepped out of the police vehicle, her wrists cuffed and her head bowed, the flashing lights painted her face in harsh white and blue. Some reporters called out questions, "Rashawn, did you mean to shoot him?" But she kept her eyes fixed on the ground. The sound of camera shutters filled the air, drowning out her quiet breathing. She was no longer a nurse, no longer a wife, no longer a mother in pain. To the world, she was now a headline. A story to be debated, dissected, and judged from behind screens. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy. Her attorney whispered instructions, but Rashawn barely responded. The prosecutor described the case as a senseless killing. The judge asked if she understood the charge of murder. She nodded, tears sliding down her face, silent. When the judge announced her bond, $50,000, there was a brief pause, as if the entire room exhaled at once. 50,000. To some, it sounded lenient. To others, unfair. But to Rashawn, it was just a number attached to a life she no longer recognized. Outside, news stations began their live segments. "We're following breaking news in Jackson where a 30-year-old nurse has been charged with murder after shooting her husband," the anchors spoke in calm, detached tones, while photos of the couple flashed on screen, smiling vacation pictures, their child between them, laughter frozen in time. Those who knew them struggled to reconcile the images with the tragedy. A coworker told a reporter, she was the sweetest person. Always talking about her family. But online, the tone was different, harsher, faster, colder. Within hours, social media exploded. Twitter threads, Facebook posts, TikTok videos, everyone had an opinion. Some called it self-defense. Others called it murder. A woman tweeted, "I've been in her shoes, when you're scared and no one believes you." Another replied, "Scared of what? A Facebook request? That's no reason to kill a man." The comments piled up, each one more emotional than the last. Hashtags began trending, hashtag justice for Rashawn, hashtag justice for Damon, hashtag friend request murder. In the digital age, everyone becomes both jury and judge. News stations replayed the 911 call. Talk shows debated whether it was a crime of passion or premeditated rage. One morning anchor said, "It's hard to believe something as trivial as social media could lead to such tragedy." But it wasn't social media that killed them. It was silence. Pride. Fear. The things no one saw on camera. In Jackson, the story struck a nerve. People saw themselves in it, in the arguments over phones, in the jealousy that hides beneath everyday love, in the way small misunderstandings can grow into storms. Outside the courthouse, people gathered, some holding signs that read, "Free Rashawn, self-defense is not a crime." Others carried posters with Damon's face, demanding justice. 2 lives. 2 truths. 1 tragedy. Meanwhile, back on Brook Hollow Drive, the house sat quiet, its windows boarded and its yard unkept. Neighbors still slowed down when passing by, some shaking their heads, others whispering prayers. They were good people, one woman said. They just got lost in something they couldn't control. Inside, the living room remained as it was, coffee cups still on the table, toys scattered near the couch, a dark stain on the floor that no one could clean from memory. In the days that followed, Rashawn's family spoke publicly for the first time. Her sister told reporters she was scared of him that morning. For investigators, the case became about one question: was it fear or fury? They examined body cam footage, crime scene photos, text messages from both phones. One detective later said, "You could feel how fast it all happened. 10 seconds changed 2 lives." The police noted the warning shot, the distance between the couple, the location of the shell casings. Everything pointed to an argument that escalated too quickly for reason to intervene. Still, the district attorney decided to pursue the case as murder. Intent, he said during a press briefing, is determined by action, not emotion. It was a sentence that echoed across the internet, clipped, quoted, shared. But intent, as anyone who's ever been afraid knows, is never that simple. As the first week passed, national media picked up the story. Commentators debated not just the case, but what it represented, the fragile line between love and control, the quiet dangers inside relationships that look perfect from the outside. On podcasts and news panels, experts discussed the psychology of fear, the weight of jealousy, and the digital age of distrust. But behind those conversations were real people, a woman sleeping in a cell, a family planning a funeral, a child asking why both parents were gone. Rashawn's bail was eventually posted. When she walked out of custody days later, she looked smaller, quieter. Cameras followed her, but she didn't speak. Her attorney simply said, "This was self-defense, and we intend to prove it." Behind her, supporters held up signs of prayer hands and hearts. Across town, others gathered at a candlelight vigil for Damon, their candles flickering in the cold air. 2 different crowds. 2 versions of the same story. The tragedy had become bigger than anyone could control. News headlines had turned into opinion wars. Friends had turned into strangers. Every detail, every photo, every text, was being analyzed by people who had never met them. And yet, the one question that still haunted everyone was the same one that began it all: how could something so small end this way? In the days following the shooting, Jackson police detectives worked quietly but methodically to reconstruct what happened on Brook Hollow Drive. They had 2 goals: to understand what triggered the violence, and to determine whether it was murder or self-defense. Inside the small, single-story home, every object became a clue. The broken phone on the kitchen counter. The bullet holes in the drywall. The overturned mug still stained with coffee. Even the silence inside the rooms carried a kind of evidence, the aftermath of fear, pride, and heartbreak. Detective Marcus Hill was one of the first investigators on the scene. He described it later as a tragedy that didn't make sense. The layout was simple: living room near the front, hallway leading to 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen by the side door. Damon's body had been found near the hallway entrance, half inside the living room. The medical examiner confirmed he was struck once in the upper chest, the bullet traveling downward, consistent with someone standing a few feet away. That detail would become crucial. Rashawn's gun, a licensed 9mm she purchased 3 years earlier, was found on the carpet near the sofa, fingerprints matching only hers. The first bullet, the warning shot, was recovered from the wall in the bedroom. Investigators photographed everything, from the direction of the bullet path to the scuff marks near the hallway floor. They found no evidence of forced entry or struggle beyond the immediate confrontation. But what they did find were layers of history written in text messages and social media posts, months of quiet tension, arguments that began online and spilled into real life. They pulled messages from both of their phones. In one, sent a week before the shooting, Damon wrote, "I just don't trust how you move lately." Rashawn replied, "You're overthinking everything." Another message from that same night read, "If you keep pushing me, you'll regret it." That text came from Damon's phone. The defense would later argue it showed a pattern of emotional intimidation. The prosecution, however, saw it differently. They said it revealed a couple in chaos, both capable of saying things they didn't mean. The police report described the scene as consistent with a domestic dispute escalating rapidly. Neighbors confirmed hearing shouting around 9:30 a.m., followed by a pause, then 2 gunshots. One neighbor, Mrs. Ellen James, said she'd heard Rashawn crying long before the sirens arrived. She was screaming his name like she thought he could still hear her, Ellen told investigators. It didn't sound like a killer. It sounded like someone who'd lost everything in 1 second. Forensic analysis also supported parts of Rashawn's account. Gunpowder residue patterns showed the fatal shot was fired from a short distance, roughly 6 to 8 feet. That detail, combined with the warning shot, raised questions about intent. Was she aiming to stop him, or did fear drive her hand? Detectives interviewed her multiple times, and her story never changed. He grabbed her, she warned him, and she fired when he came closer. Still, investigators had to consider every angle. The lead prosecutor, a man named Brian Holt, told the press, "Intent is what separates murder from defense. We have to prove what was in her mind when she pulled that trigger. But proving someone's state of mind is nearly impossible. Fear doesn't leave fingerprints. Panic doesn't show up in autopsy reports." All investigators could do was piece together what happened in the seconds before the gun went off, 2 lives collapsing under the weight of emotion. While police gathered evidence, the district attorney's office began preparing for trial. Holt's team framed the case as preventable, a moment of anger disguised as fear. They pointed to Rashawn's training as a nurse, arguing that she knew how to de-escalate emergencies. They claimed she could have left the house, taken her child, or called for help. The defense countered that those options assume calm logic, something no one has when faced with sudden threat. Her lawyer, a quiet but seasoned attorney named Terrence Carter, painted a different picture. He described Rashawn as a woman pushed to her breaking point, living in emotional captivity for months. He released excerpts from her journal entries, words written late at night, filled with exhaustion and doubt. In one entry dated February 10, she wrote, "He loves me, but sometimes I feel trapped." In another, "I keep praying he finds peace so we can too." Those sentences, once private, now became her lifeline, proof that she was afraid long before she ever touched a gun. The autopsy confirmed that Damon had no drugs or alcohol in his system, which supported both narratives. A sober man could be either calm or dangerously focused. There were bruises on his forearm, possibly from the confrontation, but nothing that clearly proved or disproved aggression. Forensic experts testified that the evidence did not contradict Rashawn's version of events. Still, in Mississippi, self-defense cases involving intimate partners are complex. The burden is on the accused to show they had no safe way to retreat. And in that moment, with her child nearby and a man advancing toward her, the line between safety and survival blurred beyond measure. Outside the courthouse, the noise kept growing. Media outlets replayed police footage frame by frame. Some commentators said the warning shot showed restraint, others claimed it revealed control. Talk shows debated what fear really looks like. One legal analyst said, if she truly feared for her life, why didn't she leave sooner? Another countered, why do we always ask that question of women, and not the men who make them afraid? The case was no longer just about Rashawn and Damon. It had become a mirror, one reflecting how people view love, power, and protection. Meanwhile, Rashawn's attorney requested her release pending trial, citing her cooperation and lack of prior record. The judge approved it under strict conditions. She was to remain in the state, surrender her passport, and avoid contact with either family. When she returned home, not to Brook Hollow, but to her sister's apartment, she found herself unable to sleep. She would sit by the window for hours, staring into the dark, whispering prayers for the man she'd lost and the child now asking for his father. Detectives eventually closed their field investigation, handing everything to the district attorney's office. But even as the paperwork piled up, one unanswered question haunted everyone involved: was this a crime born from anger, or the desperate act of a woman who thought she wouldn't make it out alive? The truth lay buried beneath both possibilities, a truth too fragile to fit neatly into a police report. In the end, the investigation revealed what most tragedies do, that love and danger often share the same address. That fear wears many faces. And that sometimes, the question isn't who was right or wrong, but how two people who once loved each other lost sight of who they were before everything broke. When the trial began, the courtroom was silent except for the hum of cameras outside. Every seat was filled, reporters, curious locals, supporters, critics, all waiting to witness what had started as a private argument and become a national debate. At the front sat Rashawn Wallace, dressed in a plain beige suit, her hair pulled back, her face pale and unreadable. Behind her, her sister clutched a tissue, whispering prayers under her breath. Across the aisle, Damon's family sat together, their faces hardened by grief. Between them was an empty space that once belonged to love. Now occupied by lawyers, evidence, and unanswered questions. The prosecutor's opening statement was simple but cutting. This case, he said, is about choice. He told the jury that Rashawn could have walked away, that she could have called for help, but instead she chose to end a man's life. He held up a photo of Damon, smiling, full of life, and paused long enough for the silence to ache. Then he turned toward Rashawn and said softly, "Fear doesn't justify murder." The words hung heavy in the air, echoing like a judgment before the trial had even begun. Her defense attorney, Terrence Carter, waited for the room to settle before speaking. His tone was calm, almost gentle. "This case," he began, "is about survival." He reminded the jury that fear is not a theory, it's a heartbeat, a shaking hand, a split-second decision between life and death. He described Rashawn not as a killer, but as a woman who'd been pushed to her limits by months of emotional suffocation. She wasn't choosing violence, he said. She was choosing to live. Throughout the trial, both sides painted pictures of two very different mornings. The prosecution focused on logic, timelines, distances, calculations. They brought in a forensic expert who testified that the second bullet was fired from several feet away, suggesting time to think. They argued that this time to think made it murder. The defense countered with emotion, showing photos, texts, and diary entries that spoke of fear and exhaustion. She warned him, Carter repeated again and again. She begged him to stop. The most haunting moment came when the 911 recording was played for the court. Rashawn's trembling voice filled the room, crying and praying between words. You could hear her desperation, her disbelief, her pleading. Even the judge looked down briefly as it played. Damon's mother covered her face with both hands, her sobs echoing softly through the quiet. The sound of Rashawn's voice, broken, begging, frantic. Was no longer evidence. It was a wound that reopened for everyone who heard it. Next came the police body cam footage. Jurors watched officers enter the home, Rashawn crying on the floor, blood staining her clothes, her hands trembling as she said, "I told him to stop." The footage showed no aggression, no resistance. Just shock. Still, the prosecutor pressed the point, even after the first shot, she didn't leave. She had options. But defense witnesses disagreed. A psychologist testified that in moments of panic, rational options disappear. The human brain, she said, does not calculate escape routes under perceived threat. It reacts. Then came the testimony that silenced the courtroom. Rashawn herself took the stand. Her voice was soft, each word measured as if it might break. She spoke about her marriage, the love that was once beautiful, the fear that came later, the mourning that destroyed everything. "I didn't want to hurt him," she said, tears pooling in her eyes. "I just wanted him to stop." She described how he'd grabbed her arm, how his voice changed, how she felt trapped with her child in the next room. "I was scared," she said. "Not of dying. But of my child seeing it happen." When the prosecutor cross-examined her, his tone was precise. "You're a nurse, correct?" She nodded. "You're trained to stay calm under pressure, to save lives?" She nodded again. "So why didn't you stay calm that morning?" For a moment, the courtroom was still. Rashawn took a deep breath and said, "Because that morning, I wasn't a nurse. I was a woman afraid of someone she loved." The line landed like a whisper that cut through the noise. Over the following days, witnesses were called, neighbors, co-workers, friends. Each added another layer to the story. One co-worker said, "She was quiet, but sometimes you could tell something was wrong at home." A neighbor said, "He loved her, but he had a temper." We all knew they argued. But even with testimony, no one could fully explain that final moment, the fraction of a second between fear and action. And that uncertainty became the heart of the trial. The jury watched as the attorneys gave their closing statements. The prosecutor repeated his central argument, 2 shots. One warning, one fatal. That's not instinct. That's decision. He told the jury that law cannot bend for emotion, that everyone is accountable for the lives they take. The defense stood and replied, "We ask you not to see her as a headline, but as a human being. This is not a case of choice. It's a case of reaction." Carter's final words lingered, "We do not get to decide how someone's fear should look. We only get to ask if it was real." As the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom grew silent again. Rashawn sat motionless, her fingers interlocked, eyes closed as if in prayer. Damon's mother clutched a photo of her son, whispering under her breath. Hours passed like days. Reporters outside speculated, social media boiled over with theories, and the world waited for a verdict that could never bring peace to either side. When the jurors finally returned, everyone stood. The foreperson's voice was steady, unreadable. The verdict was not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter. A decision that neither freed nor condemned her completely. Rashawn's face fell into her hands, tears flooding out in silence. Across the aisle, Damon's family wept too, grief meeting grief in a room built for justice, but heavy with sorrow. The judge's gavel struck once. Court is adjourned. But no one really left that courtroom whole. One life ended, one forever marked, and a child caught in between. The trial had given an answer in law, but no resolution in heart. As Rashawn was escorted out, her lawyer whispered, "You're going home soon." But she didn't smile. She looked ahead with empty eyes, whispering, "There's no home left." When the cameras left and the courtroom emptied, Jackson went quiet again. The story that had once consumed headlines slowly drifted into the background, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher news, and louder noise. But for those who lived it, for Rashawn, for Damon's family, for the child who would grow up asking why, the silence never truly returned. Brook Hollow Drive still stood, its trees swaying in the Mississippi wind, but the laughter that once filled that home was gone forever. Inside, the echoes of that morning lingered like ghosts, reminders of how fast love can turn into loss. Rashawn Wallace walked out of jail weeks later under a plea agreement that spared her the rest of her youth. She returned to her sister's home, not the house she once shared with Damon, but a smaller, quieter place where the walls didn't remember him. Reporters tried to get statements, but she said nothing. She moved through her days softly, like someone living between worlds. Her nursing license was suspended indefinitely, and her future uncertain. But she didn't care about any of that. Her voice.
If I put this wig in my head, it's over. If I put this wig in my head, it's over. If I put this wig in my head, it's over. But you bitches, cause that bitch finna be mad, okay?
When she finally spoke to a close friend, was tired. I see his face every night, she said. I don't dream anymore. I just remember. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, Damon's mother kept a framed picture of her son on the mantle, the same one used in court. Each year on his birthday, she lit a candle and played his favorite song. For her, forgiveness wasn't possible. She took my child, she said once in an interview. No explanation will ever make that right. But even in her anger, there was grief, the kind that never finds closure, only endurance. For her, justice was never enough, because justice couldn't undo what love and pride had destroyed. In the months that followed, the case sparked national conversations about self-defense, emotional abuse, and the invisible battles happening behind closed doors. Experts debated the difference between danger and fear, between reaction and intention. Some saw Rashawn as a victim of circumstance, a woman who survived what she thought would kill her. Others saw her as reckless, a symbol of how easily accountability gets blurred by sympathy. But most people, after all the debates quieted, were left with something simpler: sadness. Sadness for the life lost, the woman broken, and the child who would grow up with two empty spaces where love should have been. For many women, Rashawn's story felt too familiar. The fear of walking on eggshells, the exhaustion of explaining yourself to someone who doesn't want to listen, the quiet prayers for peace that never comes. They saw themselves in her silence, in her trembling hands, in the way she begged, "I didn't mean to." For many men, Damon's story also struck deep: the struggle with pride, the silent war between insecurity and affection, the need to be respected even when you're scared of losing everything. In the end, both were victims of something larger than themselves, the invisible weight of unspoken pain. The tragedy on Brook Hollow Drive wasn't about a Facebook friend request. It was about everything that came before it: the slow erosion of trust, the quiet resentment, the moments when love becomes possession, and fear becomes home. It was about how easily relationships built on love can crumble when pride replaces vulnerability. It was about how silence can be just as dangerous as rage. It was about what happens when two people who once promised to protect each other forget how to talk before they fight. In court, the law decided guilt. But in life, there are no clear verdicts. There's only memory, and the haunting question of what if. What if he had paused before shouting? What if she had left before reaching for the gun? What if love had been enough to drown out fear? These questions don't fade with time. They echo in every argument that turns too sharp, in every apology that comes too late, in every household where words are swallowed because someone's too proud to say, "I'm scared." Rashawn's story reminds us that self-defense isn't always about weapons. Sometimes it's about trying to survive in a life that feels like it's closing in. Sometimes it's about defending your mind, your peace, your child, even your own heart. But it also reminds us that survival comes with a price: guilt, shame, and the lifelong ache of knowing that in saving yourself, you destroyed someone you once loved. If you drive past Brook Hollow Drive today, the house still stands: new tenants, new paint, no trace of what happened inside. But if you look closely, you can almost feel the weight of that morning. A phone on a table. A message notification. A woman's trembling hands. A man's final breath. All over one moment of misunderstanding, one spark of pride, one instant too fast for reason to intervene. And so we end where it began, a quiet house, a shattered family, and a question that still divides those who hear it: when does self-defense end and responsibility begin? Was Rashawn Wallace a victim of fear or a prisoner of her own choices? Was Damon Reed a threat or a man who just needed to be heard? Maybe the truth lies somewhere between, in the space where love and fear overlap, where pride meets silence, and where tragedy waits for a chance to be prevented. If you've made it this far, take a moment to reflect, not on who was right, but on how something so human could go so wrong. Talk to someone before silence becomes your language. Listen before anger becomes your defense. Because sometimes, it's not evil that destroys love. It's ego. It's fear. It's the moment you forget that being right isn't worth being alone. And as the credits fade, remember, no one really wins when love turns into survival. The house on Brook Hollow Drive may be quiet now, but the echoes of that morning, of a mother's scream, a man's final breath, and a child's cry, still whisper the same warning to us all: speak before it's too late.